Murray, one small thing.
Yeah.
When you bring me out, can you introduce me as Joker?
That's right. Today we're talking about the new Joker movie, and I am absolutely wearing a clown shirt. Anyway, I'm sure you've heard of it. The newest and final trailer came out just last week, and there have been quite a few people complaining about it since the news broke of the Joker movie. But one woman specifically caught my eye with her post about why exactly she hates the film before she's even seen it, and there's such a lack of understanding in it for storytelling and for people that it's hard to imagine this same person might call themselves an understanding and caring individual. Granted, I don't know if those are words that she would use to describe herself because I don't know anything about Rachel Miller past this post, but I digress. She starts out by saying, okay, I've pinpointed exactly what it is that bothers me about the Joker movie. I don't want to watch a movie that shows us the trauma that drove Joker insane. I don't want to watch a well-intentioned but unstable man get bullied until he turns into a mass murderer. I don't want to watch a man get rejected by women as an excuse for his future of domestic abuse. I don't want to be shown what a poor, unfortunate underdog this man was who was sadly forced by his circumstances and that nasty Batman to take up a life of crime. So just starting with this paragraph, I don't want to watch, the obvious answer is, then don't. Don't watch it, don't go see the movie, and treat this movie like any other movie that doesn't interest you, and don't go and see it. You don't need to whine to the world about how it doesn't interest you in the same way that you likely didn't write about a blog post about why you didn't go and see Human Centipede 3 because you had no interest in watching convicts have their mouths sewn to each other's butts, and a continuation of those bizarre experiments. You probably didn't need to tell the world in a long paragraph maybe why you're not seeing Saw 7 because you're not into torture porn and gratuitous violence. And you likely didn't write a blog post about why you didn't want to see Detective Pikachu because you don't care to see a 3D lightning rat that talks and runs around in a world with other weird animal things. Because you don't care about it because it's childish. We all have movies that we don't care about. The subject matter doesn't interest us, so we just don't see it, don't care. But why are you writing a blog post about this movie you don't want to see as opposed to the other probably hundreds of movies that you don't want to watch but you've never written about? It's because you get social currencies, you get grievances for showing no sympathy and even mild disdain for the white man. Watching a character's descent into insanity is not everybody's cup of tea, I give you that. Not everyone likes or enjoys darker movies or a villain's journey from regular society into a life of crime and probably no redemption. And that's what this is. If you can watch a person struggle and eventually become better, well, we can also see stories of struggle where people ultimately become worse. You know, it's not every child that gets abused that becomes better than his abuser. In fact, more children that are abused eventually become the abuser, and it's harder to break the cycle. But we don't talk about that. We don't talk about the bad guy who is treated bad and then becomes bad and then becomes bad and then becomes bad and passes that on for generations. We rarely talk about that, but that is the more common thing. That's life. Some people are into watching that descent and understanding the dark human mind and understanding the rationale between why bad people become bad people or why people do bad things. And you might be into rom-coms or Ryan Reynolds or Jane Austen. And that's a far cry from the villain's journey into insanity and murder and mayhem and anarchy. Rachel Miller continues in her post, I don't want to have sympathy for a man best known for his robbery, murder, and arguable rape shoved down my throat for 2 hours. And again, I say don't go see the movie if the content doesn't interest you, but that doesn't mean the content doesn't interest millions of other people. She says, I don't want this to be sold as a relatable story that can happen to anyone with a bad enough day, and I don't want to be around any of the lonely white boys who relate to it. Do you see what I'm getting at? And it's at this point that Rachel Miller really shows one of her biggest flaws. She doesn't want to understand people. She doesn't want to empathize. She doesn't want to look as to why people do what they do because it's not like what she would do. Look. This is what criminal profilers and psychologists do. They seek to understand the motives behind why people do what they do. This is also what good writers do. We explore the reasons behind why someone would do something that they did, and the journey of a villain is just as interesting as the journey to a hero. At least it is for me. That's one of my favorite things to explore. She says she doesn't want the story to be sold as relatable, that this could be anyone with a bad enough day. A quick side note, I saw nobody making that excuse for the 2 Maleficent movies. But the thing is, any of us could become the villain with the right circumstances. You likely haven't seen it because it's always behind my hair, but I've got a white earring and a black earring for the duality of the human spirit. That's just, my mind is obsessed with how humans can choose to do good or choose to be evil at any given point. We're all open to making those choices and making that descent or ascent to being a better or worse person based on experiences. We're always this close. Every bad thing you see happen in society, whether it's a serial killer that's found or a mass shooter or somebody just kills their mother with their gun because they're angry, or that thing at the football field a couple days ago, has a reason for why they've come to make the decisions that they've made. It doesn't matter if they're Ted Bundy, Jeff Dahmer, Carl Panzram, or other loners. It doesn't matter if they're an ensemble like the Chicago gangs or the bank robbers. There's always a reason and a trail that you can follow that's led people to the decisions that they've made. Every time something bad happens, I explain it this way. The human body is a beaker, and inside that beaker are already a couple of elements, the biological elements, the genetic elements. What can cause an uneven explosion is piling on of certain events. When those experiences mix with the biology, it can have a bad chemical reaction, and we never know which biologies are going to mix with which experiences to create a bad, the worst thing. That's why people who lose their dads or go through a divorce or they go through the same kind of trauma as other people, they'll all react differently. That's why some become serial killers and some don't. It's not all about the biology. It's partially about the experiences mixed with the biology. But the biology alone is rarely, if ever, enough to make a monster. Ted Bundy, for example, had identity issues. His mother lied to him about being his mother and never told him the truth, even to the day that he died. She told him that his grandfather was his father and his grandmother was his mother. When Ted was an adult, he went looking for information, whatever information he could find about who his father was. He traveled to where he thought his birth was and asked for records from the nurses, and he looked around in that area to find any information of who his father was because he needed to know for his own sake, but he couldn't find anything. It's also said that his grandfather was abusive. Everybody in the immediate family described his grandfather as abusive, and Ted only knew him until 3 years of age, when he and his mother moved out of their house. But Ted never described him as abusive. But when you're 3, how are you going to remember that? Your brain is going to hide the trauma. Those experiences pile up, and he likely never trusted women because the most important woman in his life never admitted that she was his mother. Jeffrey Dahmer had abandonment issues. You can follow it through his life, as his mother wasn't happy as a housewife and she didn't feel fulfilled staying at home. She also ignored him because she wanted to be happy and she liked his little brother more than him. His dad was a workaholic in order to avoid being at home and to avoid conflict with his wife, because whenever they were around, they often got into small arguments and quibbles that could then turn into yelling. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't describe his childhood as abusive or traumatic or any of that, but he did listen to his parents argue all the time, and he was neglected by his parents and often left to his own devices. And when they divorced, they forgot about his graduation and didn't come. He was left alone at his house at 18 as his mom moved back in with her parents in another state, and his dad lived in a hotel while they were going through the divorce proceedings. He wanted to be loved, but he didn't want to risk being abandoned. He had a skewed idea of what love and companionship was because of his upbringing and his own biology, and he tried to create living dolls so he wouldn't have to kill, because he didn't like killing. He just wanted a partner that couldn't leave. And then he also kept the skulls and ate people in order to feel that companionship longer, because he felt lost when he no longer had those people with him, even if they were dead. Carl Panzram was a sodomist and a murderer from Wisconsin, and he was beat by Lutheran teachers, beat by his dad, beat by the U.S. Army, beat in the U.S. prison system starting at 16 and on. He was tortured in the U.S. prison system and raped by some randos when he was jumping trains as a teen because he was running away from home. He learned at a young age that might makes right. The supposed good guys, the church, the army, the U.S. officials, they all had no problem hurting people. He had the humanity beat out of him, and he determined that the only way to reform humanity was to kill them. So they couldn't hurt anyone else anymore. At one point, there was a prison guard who gave him $1 with no strings attached so that he could get a magazine that he liked. And Panzram was so surprised by this small act of kindness. This was one of the, if not the only person that Panzram ever had respect for on a human basis. These are all complex people with reasons behind what they did, and it makes them much more interesting than just evil is evil because evil. See the same thing in three-dimensional characters as you see in real life. Is to a rational mind, those decisions don't have to make sense. But if you look at them, you go, okay, I guess that's one way to solve a problem. It's not a good way to solve a problem, but I kind of see your logic. It is unbelievably fascinating to see how people's perspectives are shaped. If you look into the lives of monsters, then you can see why their worldviews formed the way they did. This isn't to say that they're justified, that their actions are completely forgivable or forgivable at all, but understanding why people have done what they've done, especially in the case of massive tragedies, is how we can stop it from happening again and how we can bring people back from the brink of irrational violence. How many times do I hear political people say that they want to stop mass shootings? The solution on one side is to get rid of the guns. But in order to stop mass shootings, you have to understand the shooter. We have to understand why they did what they did and what experiences they had, what thoughts they had. We have to empathize with these people so we can follow the trail and see who it might affect again in the future. We have to stop other people from experiencing those same things that cause that chemical reaction in the beaker. What we have to do is show true empathy, even for the worst of society, so we can help another person. Yet, here Rachel Miller is not interested in empathizing or understanding somebody who's had a hard time, somebody who's become a criminal because of the hard time that he's had. Rachel goes on to say, I don't know if there is ever a good time for a movie that paints mass murder as a logical conclusion of a socially isolated, debatably neurodivergent white man being failed by a system, but I feel as though this is not fucking it. I don't want to see a movie that idolizes the Joker when there are plenty of easily armed fuckboys who already think he has the right idea without adding a tragic backstory to elicit sympathy. I also don't want the narrative line to be drawn between mental illness and mass murder, as is so often done in modern eras to Batman villains, and as is so common with the Joker in particular. I don't want it to get highlighted or underlined in Sharpie as well. God, I am sick of the Joker. And that's the end of her post. She says, I don't know if there's ever a good time to watch a man descend into madness. Honey, this isn't the first time a movie like this has been made, and this certainly won't be the last. But if you're worried about the Joker convincing other young men to pick up arms as nihilistic clowns, have you considered the movies coming out that actually glamorize black men assassinating cops and actually being raised up as heroes in the film? Simply showing something is not praising it or glamorizing it. You can show a descent into madness without saying, yeah boy, this is the way to be! What your blog post underlines, and everyone who agrees with you, is that you lack the fundamental ability to empathize. You also lack a fundamental understanding of storytelling. No wonder the left writes OP characters like Captain Marvel and Rey from the new Star Wars, where they're boring and powerful for no reason whatsoever, where they have no personality, because you have no concept of cause and effect of experience shaping a person and their personality. That actions taken upon someone have consequences to their development, for better or for worse. Choices, experiences, and actions all have the ability to build or corrode a character. If you don't understand this, you can't write a good story. If you refuse to see how bad experiences often result in the creation of a villain, then you're rejecting to see reality for what it is. You're not just rejecting to see this movie, which is fine, don't go and see it if it's not your thing, but you're actively rejecting to empathize with your fellow man because for some reason you think that white men don't deserve to be understood. You're literally an NPC and you don't understand humanity, that it's flawed, irrational, and typically self-justified. A man being perpetually kicked, turning into a murdering clown. A man being perpetually kicked, turning into a murdering clown is an irrational response. But in the head of someone who is divorced from reality, it all makes sense. Just like killing a man to reform a man or murdering people in order to have companionship because he can't walk out the door if he can't move. At the end of the day, your blog post starts with, I don't want to watch. And my answer will always be, for you and for anyone else who has that feeling, then don't. That's why there's an array of movies and stories available, genres galore for your viewing pleasure. Clearly, there are a lot of people who are interested in the villain's descent or the villain's journey, but the problem comes when there's this thing you do, where you decide that if you don't want it, then now you also get to decide others don't get to want it either. You think it's your place to shut it down and stop anyone else from wanting something that you don't want. Rachel Miller and others like you, you're not my mom, you're not my wife, and you're not my overly controlling girlfriend. And worst of all of this is you don't even see what you're doing. You say you don't want to empathize, you don't want to understand, and you don't want to see what turns someone into a monster. This is the very thing that turns people into monsters. The people who need to be understood, who need a moment of mercy or compassion or an ear to listen to them. Imagine with that Joker trailer, he's just making faces at that little kid.
Can you please stop bothering my kid?
Imagine if that woman that turned around instead of snapping him said, mister, thank you, you're real funny. Imagine you've got that one person, that one guard with Carl Panzram who gave him $1. Imagine if somebody is having that kind of day, if you just sprinkle a little bit of kindness, a little bit of compassion, a little ear to somebody, and you say thank you instead of snapping at them or saying, I don't care about you. Imagine the life you could change. When they feel like there's no one left, then they're backed into a corner and no one cares, or everyone is violent anyway, then that's what creates these people you say you don't want to watch or understand or glorify ever again. You are a factory of creating people like this. And yeah, you are creating them. As Mary Shelley showed us in her novel Frankenstein, monsters aren't born, they're created. And your vitriol and blatant hatred for white men is the electricity that brings out the monster to life when it hits just the right body. But let me know what you think, guys. Is there value in telling the villain's story and understanding bad guys? When you see a bad guy on screen, do you aspire to be like them, or do you find them more interesting or entertaining? And what do you think is the cause for the increase of nihilism and psychopathy in the current culture? I look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments down below, and until next time, see ya.